Good morning. It is wonderful to be with you all this first Sunday in Lent. The color is purple. A color that is a royal color, and it's also a color of penitence. And we heard two very familiar scriptures, familiar to many of us. The story of Adam and Eve in the garden and where things went off the rails. And then the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. Our theme for Lent this year is a new understanding. We are going to be hearing stories that are very familiar to many of us, but we are going to take a look at these stories and see the new understanding that has come about in them. Because as we were looking at all of the stories for Lent, it seems like that there is a character in each one of those stories that comes to a new understanding about who he or she is. And then our prayer is that we also gain some new understanding within ourselves. The story of Jesus in the wilderness is so familiar to many of us, and we know how it ends, right? I mean, when Jesus enters into the wilderness, we know that there are going to be 3 temptations and that he is going to come through it with flying colors. But I think that our task this morning is to try to make that story strange again. To try to make it unfamiliar again. As I was studying the text this week, I came across some really interesting things that I'd like to share with you. The temptation story appears in Matthew and Mark and Luke, and in each of those 3 Gospels, it comes immediately after Jesus' baptism. The water hasn't even dried on his head yet, and he enters the wilderness. But each of those 3 Gospels frames the story in a different way. In Luke, Jesus is tempted by the devil for 40 days. Mark is much shorter, much more abbreviated. It's just a few verses, a very few verses. And Mark just says that Jesus is in the wilderness fasting and tempted by the devil, and that he's there for 40 days. Matthew, however, begins with a statement of purpose. The Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness so that he can undergo temptation. It's very interesting. And Jesus takes on the preparation necessary to enter a time of trial. He fasts for 40 days. In many of our wisdom traditions from around the world, and in initiation rites, there is often a period of fasting that a person undergoes because the experience, say a vision quest or an initiation rite, is going to move that person from where they were before into a new place. And that is certainly the case with Jesus. Matthew is also pulling from the great wilderness tradition that is in Scripture. Moses encounters the burning bush in the wilderness. And then after he leads the people of Israel out of bondage, and they spend 40 years in the wilderness. And Moses also spends 40 days and 40 nights up on the holy mountain receiving the 10 Commandments. Elijah spends 40 days in the wilderness near that same holy mountain. It's a really strong tradition. The prophets refer to it over and over again. It is in the wilderness in which Israel's identity is forged as the people of God. And then when the people forget about God and they begin to stray and they begin playing the worldly game of power politics between Egypt on the one hand and Babylon on the other, the prophets refer back to that wilderness time over and over and over again. And particularly in Jeremiah, the voice of God and the voice of the prophet get so embroidered together that the prophet's voice disappears and all we hear is God saying, I remember when I took you into the wilderness, how you were like my bride. And then you strayed. What wrong did you find in me that you strayed from me? It's in the 2nd chapter of Jeremiah. So this wilderness tradition is a major biblical motif. And that is the place that Jesus goes to undergo trial and temptation. But I have a wondering about this. The familiarity that we have with this story, we know how it turns out, right? Of course, Jesus is Jesus Christ, and so he is going to undergo temptation, and of course he's going to defeat all those temptations, right? But I wonder, did he know what his mission, what his call was fully before he went into the wilderness? Did he know the extent that that call would take him before he entered the wilderness? Or was that something that he began to discover when he was there, undergoing temptation? And of course, the tempter, or the devil, is the one that he encounters. It's interesting, that word devil has root words in Greek, dia and balo. And balo is a verb which means to throw. And when you put the two words together, it means to throw across. But in a broader meaning, it means to mislead or to slander or to deceive. And this is the tempter that Jesus encounters during this wilderness time. Now, this devil in this story doesn't have a face. And I think that that's what makes it really, really strange, is to consider how evil can masquerade without a face. And the three temptations are temptations, each one of them to abuse power. You're hungry. You haven't eaten for 40 days. Turn these stones into bread. And Jesus counters with Scripture. And then there is the temptation to dare God, to keep him safe and secure by throwing himself off of a building. And Jesus counters with Scripture. And then there is the temptation to change his loyalty from God so that he can have power over all of the kingdoms and the dominions of the earth. And Jesus counters with Scripture. And I think with each of these temptations, Jesus gains more understanding about the kind of power that he is going to live out of throughout his teaching and preaching and miracles. It's the kind of power which is acted on behalf of others. It's a shared relational power. It is not a power taking unto itself for its own sake. And then he comes out on the other side, and he has an idea of who he is, whose he is, and what his work is. We each face temptations of a similar nature. Temptations about how we use our power. Do we use our power on behalf of others? Or do we do it for our own position, our own esteem? The church itself, the church with a capital C, faces similar temptations. And the track record of the church isn't very good in dealing with these temptations of power. But the wilderness is a space in which those temptations can be met, and in which through spiritual discipline, through prayer, we can remember who we are, whose we are, and what our call is. Lent is that space. Lent is a wilderness space for us to practice our spiritual disciplines just as Jesus was doing, to counter those temptations, and to remember who we are, and to gain a new understanding